Welcome back to another installment of our series, The Codes of Perception. And we have discussed in other installments of the series the nature of belief and how it is instantiated in the brain. Today we focus on religious beliefs. We will not be controversial and challenge in any way religious beliefs or discuss the collision with findings of science, such as philosophers such as Daniel Dennett have done explicitly on YouTube and in writing. We will rather focus on what is called the cognitive science of religion. We will anchor this presentation on a paper, The Cognitive and Neural Foundations of Religious Belief, which appeared in 2008. So it's a little older than some of the papers we have discussed in the past, which were hot off the press. However, this paper originates from the National Institute of Health and thus has the imprimatur of scientific validity and the approval of the scientific community. Now, this belongs into a field which was started many, many years ago by Edward Wilson, an etymologist at Harvard, who started a movement called sociobiology. He was way ahead of his time, and his textbook, Sociobiology, was rapidly attacked at the time by academia and the public press as well. He wrote in a more recent book on consilience, the human mind evolved to believe in the gods. It did not evolve to believe in biology, or for that matter, science. Acceptance of the supernatural conveyed a great advantage throughout prehistory when the brain was evolving. Thus, it is in sharp contrast to biology, which was developed as a product of the modern age and is not underwritten by genetic algorithms. That is a very concise summary of the field that we find ourselves in. Now, I want to alert you to a number of books which have appeared in the last 10 years or so. Here is The Faith Instinct by Nicholas Wade. Nicholas Wade is a science writer for the New York Times. And in this book, he goes into the prehistory of religion, namely the study of religion in hunter-gatherers as they still existed or exist today in the Kalahari Desert of Africa and in New Guinea, Papua, and other regions where modern life has not made its appearance as yet. We can also look at archaeological records, namely when did people attend to the deceased by adorning grave sites and putting items of value with the deceased into the ground. And all this data can be utilized to analyze religious attitudes dating back many thousands of years into the Stone Age and pre-Stone Age hunter-gatherer societies. And Nicholas Wade makes the case that what we today categorize as religious beliefs is maybe a long distance from early man's feeling towards religion, which was mostly implemented in ritual, in dancing, often throughout the night or several days, generating trance episodes, which then allowed the communication with supernatural agents. The next book here is Why Religion is Natural and Science is Not. This is by Robert McCauley, who has been involved in this field for a number of years. He makes the case that religious beliefs tap into a cognitive armamentarium of the mind that is not the one that we utilize for science, namely analytical, slow, dissective thinking. Rather, it taps into modules that are pre-existing in the brain that lend itself to rapid processing of information. And here is Ara Norazania's book, Big Gods. Now, this researcher is at the University of British Columbia, which now has an international consortium looking at what big data from all over the world can tell us about the evolution of religious thoughts. And one of his main points is that big gods have big eyes in the sky. They see everything and they facilitate moral behavior and thus enhance social cohesion. For example, widespread networks of Armenian and Jewish traders, maybe 1000 BC, had to base their interactions largely on trust. And trust was not enforceable in any particular way in a legal sense at that time, but rather had to be based on shared religious ideas that those who broke trust and didn't keep contracts would be persecuted by supernatural agents down the road. In a similar way, Dominic Johnson here, God is Watching, also make the case that supernatural agents that keep track of your behavior will enhance social cohesion. Now, in the next slide, we turn to David Hume, who in the 1700s, in his Natural History of Religion, stated, "As every inquiry with which regards religion is of the utmost importance, there are two questions in particular which challenge our attention, to wit, that concerning the foundation in reason, and that concerning its origin in human nature." And that's, of course, what we're going to talk about here today, namely the cognitive science of religion, those modules in the brain that lend themselves to implementing religious thoughts. Now, as a corollary, religion, of course, is no stranger in the United States. It's a very religious country. It's ubiquitous. Well over 90% of the population claims to believe in God, and about 40% believe that Jesus Christ will return to earth in the next half century. There have been questionnaires by the Pew Research Institute to look at the question whether an atheist could become president of the United States. Fat chance. It ain't gonna happen. So there is a very strong pervasive sense that religious beliefs are required for you to have any confidence in your leaders. Now, at the same time, we know, of course, that evolution has imprinted our ancient history into our neural circuitry, thus making us able to survive challenges in the environments, to have flexibility of mind, allowing us, upon exit from Africa about 50,000 years ago, to make it all over the world, to cold climates all the way to Australia and the southern tip of South America. This required great inventiveness and flexibility of mind. And there is now strong evidence that intuitive morality is wired into the brain's genetic circuitry. So our question then is, what about religion? How can we conceptualize religion in this particular context? And here I introduce you to the so-called standard model of cognitive science of religion. So there has been so much research in this particular field that the researchers use this term standard model without blinking an eye. And there are a number of components to the standard model which we will look at in sequence. The first one is naturalism, meaning that religion, often conceptualized as a metaphysical or non-physical entity, must also be seen as a natural phenomenon. No ifs and or buts. Well, I know we are all dualists inside to some extent. However, in terms of science, there's only one domain of science, namely the natural world. So that's one of the tenets of the standard model of the cognitive science of religion. The other one is a rejection of religion being sui generis, namely being so different, metaphysically, ontologically different, that it cannot be possibly addressed by scientific inquiry. So we will reject that idea if we want to stay with the so-called standard model. Now, the other one is that religious sine qua non is belief in supernatural agents. Religions vary widely in doctrine, in different manifestation, in all kinds of ways. However, the idea of supernatural agents is universal in all religions. This then collides with science, namely the computational theory of mind. So neuroscience has arrived at the point where we believe that there are modules in the brain that interact with each other that are designed to process information such as visual input, auditory input, and, for example, theory of mind, our ability to imagine what other people might be thinking and feeling and how we might be coming across to other people. Now, the main causes of religious beliefs are unconscious. Now, that might seem counterintuitive because we have the notion that religion is something that is revealed to us. Moses came down from the mountain and he told his folk to believe in certain ideas that God had proposed to him. However, in terms of the cognitive science of religion, it turns out that the way we build up notions and intuitions of religious content are often not accessible to introspection. As a corollary, we have the modularity of brain states. There are sets of problem-solving units in the brain, such as, for example, the theory of mind module that's been well characterized and the anatomical location of which has been quite clearly delineated. Finally, evolutionary psychology comes into play. Now, evolutionary psychology is one of those things that is quite controversial, often being accused of creating so-called ad hoc stories, justifying certain deduction by making up a story just so it fits the hypothesis that is being entertained. However, it's now a very well-established field of study that has a great deal of credibility. One of the major features is the so-called hyperactive agency detection device in the brain. If you walk down the street and it is kind of dusk, you don't see too well, and suddenly you hear a strange noise in the underbrush next to you, you will imagine, you will feel very quickly that something is afoot and there might be a sense of danger. So there is an agent, either an animal, perhaps a burglar or somebody meaning you harm that might be causing this noise. We all have this device, and this is an evolutionary device. It's better to overreact quickly and live another day than to dismiss a finding that might be erroneous and be eaten by a lion in the next minute. Now finally, there is the idea of minimally counterintuitive ideas. These are ideas that tweak the expectations of innate domain-specific inference systems. These are more likely to be retained and transmitted. For example, a ghost is just like a person, except that the ghost is transparent and he can walk through walls. Otherwise, the ghost is just like you and me. The ghost in Hamlet, for example, can talk. He addresses Hamlet directly. But otherwise, he is not physical in some way. He is ephemeral. So these are ideas that are counterintuitive to only a limited extent. And this collision with innate ideas that we have about physicality and the empirical nature of the world is very alerting to us. And it's very salient, and it makes us remember these things. And somehow these create big impressions on us. You know, for example, Christmas is coming up, and children believe that Santa Claus is up there with his reindeers in the sky, and he's delivering presents perhaps through the chimney. Now, in terms of the physics, it's very difficult for Santa Claus to get down the chimney, and many houses don't have fireplaces anyway. But that is not that important. It's only mildly counterintuitive because you want to put out some cookies and milk, and if the cookies are gone in the morning and the milk is left as well, only very little of the milk is left, then that is proof that Santa Claus was there. He drank the milk and he ate the cookies and he came down the chimney, and lo and behold, all the presents are underneath the tree. So mildly counterintuitive ideas. So this then is kind of the standard model of cognitive science of religion. These are some of the tenets that are operational in this particular field of inquiry. Now, we added a couple of papers that you will find in the presentation sections that are really quite revolutionary, that talk about how religion supports networks of people here, for example, in rural South India, or in the next one is a paper from the group of Lorenzian from British Columbia, showing that moralistic gods and supernatural punishment may expand the degree of human sociality. We talked about this earlier in the presentation. Now, some of the findings, for example, of the standard model of the cognitive science of religion include that children are intuitive theists. They're also dualists, believing that there are two kinds of substances in the world, namely the physical substance, the couch or the table or the computer, and then something ephemeral, something like a spirit or a mind or perhaps a soul. And religion and its pro-social effects are very well established now by this particular science. For example, we know that religious communities last much longer than secular communities. This has been shown in kibbutzes in Israel. Those that are much more fundamentalist, Judaistic, last much longer than those that have a more secular outlook. So here's a cartoon illustrating the minimal counterintuitive nature of things. So here we have a statue that will listen to you as you pray. And of course, statues don't listen, but they could. You know, statues almost look like people. Spirits never die. Now that's counterintuitive because humans die and all living beings die, but spirits may not die, colliding with notions that we have from physical impressions of the world. And finally, a ghost came through the wall into the room. That's counterintuitive physics. We know that you and I couldn't go through walls, but for ghosts, no big deal. They can do that, making them very memorable and very impressive to our fantasy life. So in the meantime, cognitive science has gone further. There is now a so-called embodied theory of cognition and ecological psychology. We will skip over these, although these will make an impact on our view of religion as well in the future. All right then, brief summary. We have talked about the theory of mind, which has a brain signature that we can detect. We know that people contain highly anthropomorphic expectations about gods. People also implicitly expect their gods' minds to work very much like human minds, displaying the same processes of perception, memory, reasoning, and motivation. If you go back to ancient Greece, at the time of Homer, perhaps 700 or so years before the Common Era, and you look at the text of the Odyssey is full of gods interfering directly in Odysseus' life. Athena, who is his main champion, will do all kinds of things to make sure that he gets home after a 10-year war at Troy to his loving wife Penelope on his home island. Poseidon, whom Odysseus has offended in multiple ways, is very invested in doing him in and not allowing him to come home. And these gods make their appearance in the text. They talk to each other. They negotiate with each other. They talk to the humans as well. They appear and make their intentions known and directly interfere in human destiny. So one of the key fundamental assumptions then of the cognitive science of religion is that religious thoughts are emergent properties of our standard cognitive capacities. So there's nothing extra, there's nothing metaphysical or differently ontological here. The existing circuitry and our existing cognitive capacities support with these minor tweaks of counterintuitive ideas, the emergence of religious thought. So, for example, in the paper under discussion here, there are several themes such as God's level of involvement, God's level of anger that are important here, and doctrinal knowledge as well. Let's go to the next slide and see how this plays out. Now, the way that was just done in this study is a technique of multidimensional scaling was used. This is a data reduction technique, and it utilizes the similarity ratings of pairs of stimuli or sentences or ideas, and you then boil down the multiple comparisons, kind of like reducing a sauce like the chef would do in a French kitchen. And in the end, you wind up with a reduced set of ideas that encapsulate all the variability of multiple statements that are counter each other. So here's then a number of these statements. For example, religion dictates a stance on casual sex. Religion consecrates people's marriage. God's will guides my acts. Religion dictates a stance on euthanasia. Now here in God's emotion, we have things such as the afterlife will be punishing, and God is angry. God is severe, wrathful, people go to hell. Life has no higher purpose. So these different, everyone is a sinner. Religion provides more guidance. God prohibits committing adultery. And so on and so forth. There are many statements that have been collected, and you can then extract a set of notions from these statements. Here's a bunch more. For example, God punishes people's shortcoming. God is angered by my sins. God is ever present. Jesus is the Son of God, and so on and so forth. So when all this is boiled down with multidimensional scaling, you wind up with only three-dimensional solutions. And these are God's perceived level of involvement in the world, God's perceived emotion, and religious knowledge, which has two components, namely the doctrinal part of knowledge and an experiential part of knowledge. So here then are the three dimensions that were extracted by multidimensional scaling. And as you can see, they capture the variance with a very high degree of faithfulness. Namely, dimension 1, D1, correlates with God's level of involvement, correlation 0.994. Dimension 2 correlates negatively with God's perceived anger, 0.953, and God's perceived love, 0.953. And dimension 3 correlated positively with doctrinal and negatively with experiential religious knowledge. So these are then the three items. You can see that two of these, God's perceived level of involvement and God's perceived emotions, already tap into circuitry in the brain such as the theory of mind centers in the brain. So for example, statements that relate to God's level of involvement are as follows. God is removed from the world. Life has no higher purpose. God will guide my acts. In a positive way, God protect one's life. God is punishing. So there are uninvolved supernatural agents and involved supernatural agents captured by this kind of dimension. The other is the emotional dimension, such as God is forgiving. God protects all people. The afterlife will be punishing, and so on and so forth, dissociating two aspects of emotion, namely the loving and potentially rewarding aspect of God's emotional life and the punishing aspects of supernatural agent. Now the religious knowledge dimension, as mentioned before, has the doctrinal what the church fathers tell you to believe and the experiential aspect of what you believe. Now, there is a dissociation between what people believe internally and their lived religion in daily life and what the church teaches. The believers know, by and large, what the teachings of the church are. They go to church school, they have a catechism, they learn these things, they get baptized, they get confirmed, and they learn all the doctrinal elements. However, in real life, they believe in a very anthropomorphic God. Namely, God is in heaven. He keeps track of me. He takes a personal interest in me. They have trouble with the Trinity of God, the Holy Ghost, and Jesus, which is a very counterintuitive concept. And people will talk to Jesus directly. If you look at Gospels in the African American church, Jesus is perceived as a very much an individual person or agent that can be addressed directly and is experienced in a very primary and direct way, and that does not, of course, correspond to doctrinal teaching. So here then again are the different items. God's involvement is then hypothesized to tap into the theory of mind-related network, whereas the doctrinal knowledge engages networks processing abstract semantic ideas. That makes a lot of sense. And experiential knowledge engages memory retrieval and imagery, and religious belief engages cognitive emotional interfaces. So in experiment 1, then, these multi-dimensional scalings were performed and fMRIs were done to find a signal in the fMRI that might correspond to these dimensions D1, D2, and D3. Now, in the final experiment, the subject was looking at statements like we have discussed before. God is involved in my life, God will be punishing, God is forgiving, and so on and so forth. And then a fMRI data collection is triggered, like an event-related potential, to see which brain areas are activated when dimension D1, D2, or D3 are operational in the patient's mind and in the patient's brain. And so here are the findings. Here we look at God's lack of involvement in my life. So this is a theory of mind event, and sure enough, you see the inferior medial frontal cortex is involved, very much an area that has been evoked to be part of the theory of mind network. So the pattern of activation then implies the theory of mind processes were engaged to understand God's intent and resolve the negative emotional significance of his lack of involvement. So here are the striking findings about God's perceived emotion, either love on the left and anger on the right. So you can see that a distinct area of the brain is involved in the emotion of love, namely the frontal areas, medial frontal areas in the God is perceived as loving, whereas in the temporal areas here, perhaps close to the temporal parietal junction, is the fallout, is the circuitry that gets triggered by processing the idea that God is angry and wrathful when reviewing you or relating to you in your religious life. And here is then experiential religious knowledge. And you can see a whole host of areas is activated. In the occipital lobe, we have, of course, the visual, imaginary aspects of God that might be involved, but a host of other areas is involved as well. Namely the fusiform gyrus, these are areas involved in facial perception. The precuneus, these are areas involved in the default mode network where mind wandering takes place and models of relationships are being entertained in the absence of immediate engagement in these kinds of relationships. Again, left prefrontal areas are involved as well. So you can see that when you trigger those aspects of your religious experience that are experiential, a number of brain areas light up that are related to these experiential experiences. And here is overall religiosity based on a self-rating scale of the subjects involved in the study. And again, the precuneus is involved here and the temporal parietal junction. Now this is the theory of mind area, the key theory of mind area, and the left medial frontal gyrus, also belonging to the theory of mind area. So religiosity as a compound idea, as a whole, your overall sense of how religious you identify, activates strongly theory of mind circuitry in the brain. In other words, nothing new is invented, but rather a pre-existing, evolved circuit designed by evolution to facilitate our interaction in social contexts also supports your idea of relationship to a supernatural agent named God. So then, religious beliefs then engage well-known brain networks performing abstract semantic processing, imagery, and intent-related and emotional theory of mind. Processes known to occur both at implicit and explicit levels. So what is meant by that? Well, religious representations activate a variety of specialized non-religious conceptual capacities. None of these handle explicit judgments about the existence of spirits, for example, but all of them run offline inferences on the assumption of spirits being around. Second, belief in supernatural agents, like many other explicit beliefs, is a high-level, conscious, meta-representational state. That is, people are aware of their assumption that, for example, ancestors are around. By contrast, they also assume that objects fall downwards, but are not necessarily aware of that assumption or are considering Newton's law of gravity. In other words, explicit beliefs of this kind are interpretation of our own mental states. So let's summarize them. We have looked at the new findings, the new science of cognitive study of religion and their standard model. Their tenets implying naturalism and no special ontological status. And here we have now a study which places religious ideas, experiences, and the experience of God, both in positive and negative aspects, into specific brain circuits that have been evolved in evolution from ancient times. And it's likely that as human sapiens, as hunter-gatherers developed religious ideas, it tapped right into these circuits, and we still do this at this time. Now, our study of religion now is very abstract. We have religious beliefs, whereas hunter-gatherers were largely expressing their religious identity in rituals and dances, often using, for example, drugs such as psilocybin or other hallucinogenic drugs. We don't do this anymore. We are rarefied. Dancing in church does not take place, with one exception, maybe two exceptions. One is the black churches in America, in the South in particular, where dances speaking in tongues are still very much in play and harken back to those times when hunter-gatherer societies expressed their connection and tapped into their perception of supernatural agents by using dancing and approaching trance states. The other one is certain aspect of Islam involve dancing and experiencing trance-like states as well. But overall, our official religions have gotten rid of ecstatic presentations and manifestations of religion and have banged on the doctrinal aspects of religion that we should all subscribe to. This may have a certain price that comes along with that, but that may be a discussion for another lecture. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll see you soon again at a presentation from Behavioral Health 2000.